Hi guys, I'm Sarah and this is Olivia. And today we're going to be talking to you through our professional development presentation, which is based around the lesson design of a class on types of invertebrates.
So ideally in a classroom, this topic would be discussed over a 2 to 3 week long unit. But for the example that we're going to be showing today is basically an introductory sort of lesson. As it is a professional development model, we're going to be just showing how the class would actually be presented to students, but also going back and forth between why we've done certain things to show to you guys. To benefit from it as well. Our learning intention is to understand what an invertebrate is and the purpose of decomposers, and our success criteria is the ability to classify animals as vertebrates or invertebrates and explain how worms are decomposers and their effect on the environment, and relating that to sustainability. There are some curriculum links just there on the PowerPoint, but we will go through them a bit more in our lesson plan, but also just sort of linking it up as we go along. In a classroom setting, the purpose of a lesson hook would be to introduce the topic and create eagerness to learn more, therefore also making it easier to retain students' attention for longer, because obviously if they do want to learn about things, they'll obviously pay a lot more attention, which is what we would want. So in a classroom setting, to begin our class on types of invertebrates, we would discuss what they are. So we've just got a bit of a diagram here that just shows the two main groups of vertebrates and invertebrates. So vertebrates are animals with a skeleton made of bones. Examples of these are humans, reptiles, and mammals, whereas invertebrates are animals without a backbone. Some examples are insects, worms, and jellyfish.
To continue on, students will be prompted towards the left side of the screen where they have a cross-section image of humans, and we'll be relating this towards the cross-section of the vertebrates beside them. We'll be looking at the similarity of their backbone structures and how it varies between the shapes and forms of these vertebrate creatures. Next, students' attention will be drawn to the right side of the screen. These invertebrates are able to be further classified according to legs, for example, no legs, 6 legs, 8 legs, etc. Another way to classify them may be if they have a soft body, a shell, or an exoskeleton. Formally, these invertebrates can be classified into their scientific categories. 8 of these such major categories are called porphyrins, cnidarians, echinoderms, mollusks, annelids, which is the most important one that we'll be looking at today, as we'll be engaging in a case study about worms, arthropods, and platyhelminthes, and also nematodes. These more advanced scientific terminology are important to expose our students to. So the Victorian curriculum requires students to be able to communicate observations, ideas, and findings, to show patterns and relationships using formal and informal scientific language. Developing an understanding of formal scientific language which underpins the scientific concepts which we'll be exploring with them for our students is paramount. When empowered with scientific language, students are able to engage in scientific discourse. They're able to articulate themselves correctly, both in discussions and the assessments which we would like them to engage in. And while sometimes difficult, teaching students scientific language includes providing digestible definitions and encouraging the language's use through verbal and written tasks.
So invertebrates' roles are widely diverse, mostly regarding food webs and ecosystem services such as pollution, decomposition, and nutrient release. Sarah said, we are focusing on worms, which are decomposers, meaning that they break down organic matter while allowing fungi to feed on it, releasing nutrients and creating a valuable kind of fertilizer. They also create tunnels, for increased water and air circulation that encourages aerobic bacteria to do their job. Due to the efficient nature of worms, they do create a natural compost, which relates to sustainability as it enhances the germination process in growing fruits, vegetables, and flowers, which it also encourages people to be more self-sufficient and actually grow their own produce.
So to transition students from this generalised discussion about invertebrates and onto worms as a particular case study, we chose to incorporate ICT through a poll. Students are able to voice their opinions about worms using their class iPads to scan the QR code and complete the survey asking who thinks worms are gross. So next we'll be exploring the topic of worms using this upbeat educational video. To ensure active engagement with this ICT medium, students should be encouraged to take notes, contribute to discussions about what they've learnt, and especially what they're left wondering about worms. This video also outlines the common misconceptions that worms are insects or even that they're related to snakes. So it outlines evidence as to why they're not. From our earlier knowledge, we know that earthworms are in fact annelids.
You know, Squeaks and I spend a lot of time underground, and that means we've made a bunch of squirmy little friends. And if you've spent any time digging in the ground, you've certainly met them too. I'm talking about earthworms. These animals are super cool and super hard-working too. Let's see if we can get the dirt on these wiggly worms. First of all, even though you often find earthworms outside where you find insects like ants and beetles, earthworms aren't insects. Can you spot the differences? Remember what makes an insect an insect? 6 legs, 3 main body parts, and a hard exoskeleton. Our earthworm doesn't match that at all. Earthworms have smooth skin and a body made up of many small segments. It kind of looks like they're covered in a lot of little rings. And each segment has small hairs that are almost too tiny to see. And even though they're long and skinny like snakes, they're not snakes. Snakes have a skeleton, and earthworms don't, but they do have strong muscles. In order to move, the earthworm squeezes its muscles together, which makes its body thinner and longer. Then the earthworm uses those little hairs on its body to hold onto the soil around it and pull itself forward. Have you ever seen a bird trying to pull an earthworm out of the ground? The worm can make it hard for the bird because it can actually hang on to the dirt with those tiny little hairs. Now, just like most animals, earthworms have a front end and a back end. Up front, you'll find their mouth and a teeny tiny brain, about the size of a pinhead. But that little brain gets the job done. Earthworms are able to sense light and vibrations, so they know when to wiggle away. And when earthworms need to wiggle away, where do they go? That's right, underground. Earthworms spend most of their time safe in underground tunnels called burrows. It not only keeps them hidden from predators, but that nice, wet soil keeps their skin moist. And that's super important because earthworms need to breathe, just like people do, but they don't do it in the same way. They actually absorb oxygen through their skin. And in order to do that, they need to keep wet. That's why you're most likely to see earthworms when you're digging through damp soil or mud. But maybe you've seen earthworms even when you haven't been making mud pies. Have you ever seen them hanging around on the sidewalk after a rainstorm? A rainy day for an earthworm is a perfect moving day. Sometimes one area becomes too crowded with earthworms, so they need to find a new home. But they need to keep their skin moist while they're out moving around. So earthworms use these soggy days to come out and look for a new place to live. Then back into the ground they go. But the dirt isn't just a safe place for worms to hide, it's also their food. As an earthworm moves through the soil, it's also eating the dirt. Earthworms get their nutrients from dead and decaying parts of plants, like leaves and roots, that are in the soil. And earthworms are hungry. They can eat half their body weight in just one day. But maybe the coolest thing about earthworms, as they munch through the soil, they actually make the soil better for the rest of us. How do they do that? Well, the tiny tunnels that earthworms make as they wiggle through the dirt help bring water and air deep into the ground, and that makes it easier for other living things like plants and fungus to live in it. Plus, as earthworms break down all of those dead plant parts, they help spread around all the nutrients that are in them to make food for new things to grow. Some people even keep earthworms in their garden on purpose. They feed the earthworms things like banana peels and apple cores. Then the worms turn those scraps into compost, a rich, smelly, nutritious kind of plant food made from dead plants. To you, it might just look like trash, but to an earthworm, it's treasure. Healthy earthworms means healthy soil, and healthy soil means healthy people, because we need it to grow plants for our own food. So the next time you come across an earthworm, thank them. They're hard at work helping flowers, trees, grass, and plants grow.
So following the video, students will be introduced to the experiment that they'd be completing, which is they're creating their own worm farm. They would also be encouraged to make their own predictions based on the knowledge that they have, obviously from the video and through discussions. This would also allow them to demonstrate their understanding of what they've learnt and be able to think ahead. This could also be applied to Glass's choice theory, as all behaviours are chosen based on a drive to satisfy their needs, therefore giving them the freedom to make their own choices and feel a sense of power over their learning. We decided to incorporate collaborative groups so that the students are in small groups to do their worm farm, just to reduce exclusion and allow the students to freely participate. They can also discuss their ideas and gain a broader understanding through different interpretations. It also caters for diverse learners, as students of a range of learning abilities will be within each group. Therefore, students who may feel a little bit more comfortable will be able to take control of the group and help those that probably need a little bit more attention. This also relates to Piaget's constructivist views of development, which consists of people learning from their experiences. Therefore, through the experiment itself and videos and discussions throughout the lesson, students' learning would increase.
Perfect. So this is the method and materials which we'll be using for the worm farm experiment. So the teacher would initially model the experiment during the I do it phase of the lesson, which students will refer back to it during the you do it together phase. Parts of the gradual release of responsibility model, which Olivia will look at further in just a moment. For students who struggle with literacy skills, supporting diagrams or photographs could be included to assist them in also creating the experiment.
So the gradual release of responsibility model plays a critical role in children's development. It examines the complex transactional process that occurs in reading comprehension, instruction as the control of an activity moves between a teacher to a learner. This is also generalized to all aspects of children's development through different practices. This is a model that's important used to signify the transition of responsibility and academic independence gained as a learner.
Perfect. So when beginning to model the experiment, the teacher would fill each of the jars with a 1/4 cup of pebbles and this with the students that it ensures the drainage of soil, so that is shown in our first image. Next, a 1/2 cup of soil is added to each jar and is dampened as well. And at this step, students should be asked why the soil is being dampened, and this will exercise their knowledge back to the earlier video which they have watched. And then they will continue on by the first and third jars are filled with 1/3 cup of food scraps, while the second and fourth are filled with 1/3 of a cup of newspaper scraps. Once again, they are all dampened, and this takes us to the third photo. As the experiment continues, the teacher would add another 1/2 cup of soil to each one of the jars, and once again, dampening the soil. Next, in the first 2 jars, 8 worms will be placed in each. After this step, students should be questioned why worms are only being added to the first 2 jars, which is opening a discussion up into why the second 2 jars are considered the controls of the experiment. Each jar is labelled and covered by breathable cloth and a rubber band. Finally, each of the jars are placed into a cool, dark place for about 2.5 weeks, dampening when required. So after all of this has been completed, the teacher should engage the students in more discussion just to solidify their learning and make them understand what they are doing throughout the experiment. So asking questions such as why are the jars being kept in a cool, dark place, relating back to the video that they've learned earlier about how worms interact in their environments. Looking at why the jars are being kept in the same conditions, and once again looking at controls. And if this is a controlled variable, what other variables are being controlled in the experiment? What are the variables that are changing? So having worms in 2 of the jars and not in the others. And what do they think the dependent variable of this task will be? 2.5 weeks pass, the contents will be emptied from the jar and the remaining scraps in each jar will be recorded and represented in both graph and table form. This lengthy experiment is why the lesson fits well into introductory lesson to a 2 to 3 week long unit. Before students enact the experiment in groups, class discussions should be held about incorporating worm farms into your lifestyle and how this can support a sustainable lifestyle, as well as discussions about safety hazards which may be present in this task. Glass jars can break easily and possibly cut students, as well as pebbles can be a choking hazard. Ensuring student safety is a requirement to the teacher's duty of care, in which all staff must take responsible steps to reduce the risk of reasonably foreseeable harm to students.
So following along what Sarah said about solidifying students' knowledge, we also want to incorporate ICT as it is one of the Victorian curriculum links. So it's just sort of to solidify their understanding again by representing the data from the experiment into some sort of report or graphical representation to communicate their ideas to other students. We also believe it's very ICT is effective as it provides different applications and programs that are usually interactive and very engaging. So we just made a little example of a graph for the results of the experiment. As you can see, the 2 control variables didn't move at all, seeing as they didn't actually have any worms in them after the 2.5 weeks, but you can see the food scraps did move down a bit and the paper scraps moved actually the most. So there was the least remaining in the cups.
Perfect. So the individual reflection task represents the I do phase of the lesson in relation to the gradual release of responsibility model. This independent stage allows students to assume all responsibility for their learning and apply their learning. For this reason, it is the most valuable stage of the class to incorporate assessment. The completion of this task informs teachers what students have learnt over the course of a lesson and therefore informing their future practice to meet any gaps of learning. During the reflection period, students are required to hypothesize the results of the experiment by drawing upon their understanding of causation and previous knowledge which they've gained over the lesson. The skill of predicting what may happen based on prior knowledge is a valuable science inquiry skill outlined in the curriculum. This reflection task is also an opportunity for students to reinforce the new vocabulary they have learnt by applying it. And so this is an example of the prompting questions that we may provide to our students. So the reflection class requires students to respond to these prompting questions, and they're used as a direct reflection and to foster sense making after engaging in the experiment.
So just as another little reflection, ideally in a classroom, students will be provided with iPads or some sort of similar technology, but obviously we understand that that can't be possible all the time. But we have created a Jamboard for students to anonymously reflect and get an idea of other people's feelings as well, just so that way they can acknowledge their learning and feelings towards the lesson. So some of the questions that we used were, what is something that you learned today? Was there anything you found most interesting? What did you enjoy the most? And what would you like to see more of in this unit? Just asking these kinds of questions also gives the teacher an indication of what kind of learners their students are and what lessons they'd find enjoyable, which would therefore impact their drive to learn, because we do want students to interact as much as possible.
Perfect. And to finish the lesson, the teacher would ask the students to engage in a second poll, cyclical to the first one that they engaged in. This one asks students who thinks that worms are cool. So it just allows the teacher to be able to see whether they've been able to change the way that students feel about worms across the course of the lesson, and just a little bit of feedback for them. Perfect. So these are the references that we've used across our lesson and presentation. And thank you so much for listening to us, and just feel free to ask us some further questions about our lesson design.